Hey everybody, I'm Candace Shigley with Utah State University Extension and the Center for Water Efficient Landscaping, and you are watching our Water Well with CWEL webinar series.
Thank you, Candace. I'm so delighted to be asked by your Center for Water-Wise Landscaping, Center for Water Efficient Landscaping. Forgive me, it's Colorado Water-Wise in my state. I'm very delighted to be asked to speak on my greatest professional passion, which is green roofs. Thankfully, there's a lot of similarities between Colorado and Utah in terms of how green roofs can be applied. And if you're not from Utah, I see a whole bunch of other locations in the chat already, New Mexico, even Colorado. So hopefully this session can give you a little bit of broad strokes on green roofs in general. So my green roof journey officially started 15 years ago on the EPA Region 8 headquarters in downtown Denver. If you're familiar with that city, here's a picture of me on EPA building right next to Union Station. So that's on 16th Street Mall. And I'm collecting data on plant growth rates in front of me. That's when I did my PhD work. And behind me is a solar panel array. And as I go, I'll fill you in on how we made some sort of accidental discoveries about the synergy between green roofs and solar panels as I go. So this journey took me a lot of places, including, I always joke, as a cover girl on the very famous Hort Science. For those of you who are horticulturalists, you might know this one. It's actually now 11 years old, so I don't even know if I get to make that joke anymore. But my green roof work really took me into the world of native plants. And so I've spent a lot of the last 20 years working on native plants in the landscape. So I'm co-author on Common Southwestern Native Plants that my late mentor, Jack Carter, who is a professor of botany at Colorado College, years ago, he actually retired in 1990, invited me to help on this book. And we were working on his trees and shrubs in New Mexico when he passed away, unfortunately, in May of 2020. And right now I'm working on trees and shrubs of Colorado. So another one of his books, doing updates, third editions of all three. So I work a lot in the native plant space. I also actually help put on the Landscaping with Colorado Native Plants Conference, which went digital this last year. It's in the winter every year. We had something like 700 attendees, and I believe we have one of your faculty members coming to speak at our conference. Well, not coming, but virtually. Yopin San is coming and speaking at our conference, if I'm not mistaken. So why I'm talking about green roofs really gets down to some fundamental things, and it has to do with where people live, urban spaces, and connection with nature. So I really like this quote from a 2020 publication, Plants, People, and Planet. Urban spaces are pivotal nodes of the global ecosystem, and it is in cities where the majority of humans and influential decision makers experience nature. And to me, that's sort of the crux of why we need to invest so much in infrastructure, invest so much in getting plants in urban spaces. And so as I go along today, I'll tell you some about my research, but also about some of my policy-related work. When you're a green roofer, you get asked to be involved a lot, especially when green roofs, which are really installed for societal benefits, end up being used in urban spaces. Because a lot of times, especially in a country where we value our bottom line, it doesn't make it worth it for individual developers to install green roofs that provide public benefits when they don't see a direct benefit to their bottom line. So that has really led me sort of kicking and screaming into the policy work. And I'll talk about that journey in water, what it has to do with it. In fact, I speak for and on panels here in Colorado all the time related to water, since green roofs are, of course, sort of an emerging water use space in landscapes. So we have data on that. So I love to show this picture. I was actually lucky enough during my PhD work to go visit Salt Lake City. And while I was there, I got a little tour of the LDS Center. It's the conference center, this massive green roof. I actually was given a tour. So this was about 2007. And a Utah State University retired pomologist gave me that tour, and I cannot recall his name. I believe he did work on cold hardiness or frost tolerance of stone fruits. But anyway, he's the one that gave me the tour. It was, in a way, sort of life-altering because it was one of the most incredible green roof systems and applications I had seen to date. Most of the green roof systems I had seen were real shadow sedum sods, so they look very much from a distance like turf, but different color. And then to come to a prairie and simulated forest green roof was just absolutely incredible. So I still cite work from an observational study on the prairie side of this work. So I wanted to give a nod to that for all of you that are locals. So what I want to talk about is some key highlights. I'm not going to bore you with a ton of data. I'm going to keep it at a high level of some of my research. I really have two main emphases currently. So green roof phenology and pollinator study, and then my rooftop agrivoltaic study, and then everything that's coming up. We're building a new campus in Denver, very much like those of you who are at Utah State, where Logan's north of the major metropolitan area. It's the same thing in Colorado. Fort Collins is north of the major metropolitan area. And I live in south of Denver. So actually, I'm going to be housed on our campus in Denver. And then I'm going to talk about outreach as it relates to green roofs. So a lot on policy, some on water, and then some of the national and international level things that I work on. I always feel like when I give these talks, there's always a way to collaborate or connect or get new resources. So I will mention all of those and a few of my key publications in case you're interested. I also teach a lot. I actually helped develop our online degree program for our department in horticultural business management. And so I teach 6 or 7 classes, one of them Hort 100, at least twice a year. And so, and Hort 44 capstone a couple times a year. So, and I just got on the tenure track. So this is helping me, getting me to be able to get in front of a wider audience. So first I want to talk about a project that my graduate student really got started. So years ago, as I was peer reviewing papers for the International Green Roof Conference in North America called Cities Alive, I ended up noticing some patterns. And one of the papers I reviewed was out of Chile. And this young scientist, this young woman, she was studying pollinator visitation on green roofs and on the ground. And the thing that she noticed was, and she just sort of anecdotally mentioned it and didn't really, focus on the data, but just mentioned it in her discussion, was that she saw flowering earlier on the green roof than on the ground. And I said, well, you need to publish this. Even at the conference in San Francisco, I said, you need to publish this somewhere because nobody's talking about this. So I'm sure if you've worked at all in the native plant world or pollinator world, or even just the landscape world, you probably know that our pollinator resources are dwindling, especially in urban areas. And so to have a resource earlier, especially as we see a lot of our our insects coming out of dormancy earlier in the year, but our plants not necessarily flowering earlier because soil temperatures lag behind air temperature. They are needing resources. And so green roofs can play a key role as a resource provider for pollinators in a time when they are absolutely starving. So I ended up talking about this with this young man, Michael Geedy. He's my graduate student. He's in his third year of Ph.D. He's also a horticulturalist at the Denver Botanic Garden. So he's actually on, these two pictures of him are on two different roofs from last summer, so just over a year ago, where he's collecting data, literally staring at plants on the bottom picture. That's our Liatris punctata alba, and he's staring at those plants to watch pollinators. We followed a citizen science protocol, but of course 2020 happened and we couldn't have citizen scientists come help us collect data, so guess who did? He and I. So here we are staring at plants, noting pollinator visitation, and on the top image, he is collecting nectar resources from Ipomopsis rubra. And there's a population on this green roof of that same species, and also on the ground that had seeded from, there's actually two green roofs at the Denver Botanic Gardens. And so he's on the two of them right there. The top one is the first one installed in 2007. That's over the Offshoots Cafe. And the bottom one is the Mordecai Children's Garden, which is in the parking garage. And that was installed in 2010. And so we're finding some really phenomenal things. We're not finding necessarily flowering timing to come 6 weeks ahead of time. And we're finding that it's dependent on species. So some species actually start flowering on a green roof 2 to 6 weeks earlier than that same species in the same aspect and orientation on the ground. But not all equally. The earlier season flowers seem to be affected more than the later season flowers, although we're even seeing a shift there. So say summer and fall flowering plants, we are seeing a shift. So watch for those papers. End of this week, I get the first draft of the first manuscript, the first thesis or first chapter of his dissertation. And so hopefully we'll have the phenology, so flowering timing, and the pollinator visitation data out hopefully by end of year, early next year. The fascinating thing on nectar production, and this is actually going to be expanded by a new graduate student I had that just started a couple of months ago, and it has to do with nectar production. So the baseline data out there in the science says that stress plants produce more resources, nectar and higher protein pollen in general. Of course, there's some variability within species. Well, Michael found in his, he looked at 3 species of penstemon, that Ipomopsis, and then another Lamiaceae, a salvia, a non-native salvia, and he looked at nectar volume, and of course we had a refractometer and looked at total concentration of sugars. And it was amazing. We saw it varied a little bit by species, but we saw an increase in nectar volume and an increase in sugar content of the nectar both. So it's the degree to which he's running those data through analysis right now. That's really going to be a significant thing. Again, it varies by species. But imagine the implications if we can have plants that flower earlier on a green roof, provide resources in a time of need, and provide higher value resources. That is a very compelling reason to install green roofs, especially in areas where pollinators are in need of resources. So, yep, there we go. The graduate students, Michael Geedy and Kyle Roskowski. So you'll start seeing publications coming out of their work. The other one I'm really passionate about, the other angle, is my work on rooftop agrivoltaics. So if you've never heard that term agrivoltaics, it's literally the combination of agriculture and photovoltaics. Photovoltaics is another term for solar panels. So as you can see there by my TED Talk, you can find my TED Talk on TED.com or on YouTube. Rooftop agrivoltaics is literally growing food under solar panels on top of buildings. So this is really important. And man, let me tell you, as a principal investigator searching out funding for this work, we are at the crux of the food, energy, water nexus. And the really exciting thing is we can produce food and energy in the same space on a rooftop and hopefully produce both of those things with less water. I know it doesn't make sense to say that solar panels require water, but energy generation in general does typically, especially our fossil fuel energy requires a lot of water for extraction and processing, etc. So to do that in a more water-wise way by using something like rooftop agrivoltaics. Now, we haven't gotten to the economics of it, and literally we just coined this term about 18 months ago. So there's not a lot out on it yet. But what we're doing, and I'll show some pictures, there's actually from 2020 our pilot study from a couple $100 shoestring budget. We begged and borrowed and grew some plants and tested them out under solar panels and in full sun. And there's my graduate student, Thomas Hickey. Thankfully, he's also works for, in his sort of day job, he works for Sandbox Solar, which is a solar provider. So he does installs, he works on panels, and he can zip tie things up in a very safe way, thankfully. And I have another student starting on this project in January. This summer, we installed a simulated green roof system. So there were existing solar panels, so that saved me a whole lot of my 10-year startup budget by having existing solar panels. I'm collaborating with a mechanical engineer who runs the next generation photovoltaics laboratory at Colorado State University. His name is Dr. Kurt Barth. And we've collaborated on a bunch of things. He let us use the space. We installed a green roof system on the ground so that we can use this area as our sort of sandbox. So we can test a whole bunch of things, and then we can take it, I'll show you on the next slide, to our new campus that is currently being built in Denver. So here's the new campus. In fact, the first building, it's called the Spur campus. You might end up hearing about it. It's going to include a whole bunch of partners. There's a building called Hydro. Here's that picture of a rendering of that building called Hydro. And a whole bunch of partnerships related to water in the West are going to be occurring there. So I'll be installing research on 2 of the 3 buildings that CSU is building. If you're familiar with Denver, it's just a north and east of I-25 and I-70, so the 2 major interstates in Denver, at the National Western Center. So it's where the National Western Stock Show happens every January. So I'm going to do a whole bunch of research. The Terra building, which is nicknamed the food building, is where I'm going to do food production and irrigation research. I'm also going to do continue the work on native plants and pollinators from the Denver Botanic Gardens work, from Michael's work. So Kyle will have his primary research there. I'm also going to do my agrivoltaics, rooftop agrivoltaics, so solar panel and green roof. We're going to look at ideal heights of the panels, ideal plants, vegetable crops, irrigation rates, all of those things. And then stormwater capture. So that's a key thing. I just received funding from our Stormwater Authority. Mile High Flood District used to be Urban Drainage and Flood Control District. They're paying for one of my graduate students who was an undergrad as a civil engineer and is getting her master's in horticulture. She did her senior thesis on stormwater capture of green roofs in Brazil. So a few things on green roof outreach that I've done. First is my policy work. And this is, like I mentioned at the beginning, where especially citizens, in this case, this is a grassroots effort, where citizens can actually expect benefits out of private landowners in a way to help with equity and a greener city. So I helped advise on an ordinance. It was called the Green Roof Ordinance, and it was went on the ballot in the city and county of Denver in the 2017 election. So it was a grassroots effort led by a young man who was passionate about acting where he lived and making a difference in the environment. And so he did his homework and he actually crafted an ordinance and got enough signatures to put it on the ballot. And he took an ordinance from the city of Toronto, Canada, on a green roof mandate. And he actually modified it quite a bit and put it on the ballot. Well, he actually came to me and was like, hey, things are progressing. Can you come help advise and answer questions for the city council attorney when they ask us questions? And I was like, okay. So I got sort of pulled in, lots of press. I had to be very careful, of course, being a university employee. But since I'm one of the few experts in green roofs in our state, of course, it was allowed for me to be involved. So it passed by a political landslide, which was like 10%. It was like a 60 to 40 passing. And I was like, they called it a landslide in the media. And I'm like, I don't think 10% is a landslide in science, but okay. And they asked me, the city of Denver asked me to be on the Green Roof Task Force because what they were faced with was a grassroots ordinance written by a citizen does not fit into city code. So either they were going to have to rewrite it, throw it out, or try to change code in the city, which was never going to happen, to allow it written as is. So I got invited with 20, 30 other folks, including some of our city council, to be on the Green Roof Task Force. It was a one-year appointment where we essentially recrafted, that's we ended up deciding to do the ordinance, and it got renamed to the Green Building Ordinance. And so it became effective in 2019, because of course we can't do things quickly. And I now sit on the Technical Advisory Committee for the Green Building Ordinance in the 2 years since it's been enacted. And so it's been quite a journey. There's all kinds of things I've learned about advising cities on green building ordinances. And it's funny because our committee is made up of very different voices. There's roofers, there's developers, there's solar providers, there's stormwater experts, several city folks, and my buddy who does green roof installs and myself. So guess who gets asked all the technical questions about incorporating plants into buildings? Man, that is very intense. So one of the things that came up during the task force that I thought you might be particularly interested in as a group, since you're interested in water efficient landscaping, is green roofs and water. Because right away, the Denver Water, which is our potable water authority, was nervous. They said, hey, we need to be on this task force. We're really concerned about a major use. And the way the ordinance was written was that 20% of all large buildings, so all buildings over 25,000 square feet indoors, had to install at least 20% of the rooftop as a green roof at the time of re-roof or at time of building. And so they were concerned because we ran a real quick and dirty analysis and found there's about 5,000 acres of rooftops on these relatively large buildings, over a 5,000 square foot footprint, each one average about 5 stories. So that got us to our 25,000 square feet. And we came up with an analysis that it was about 5,000 acres of eligible rooftop. And Denver Water said, well, if we green 20% of that, that might be a lot of water. And so they ran an in-depth analysis, and I was already afraid being on the task force that I was going to be thought of as being prejudiced towards green roofs. Well, of course, that's my area of expertise. So I was really careful. I said, you let me know if there's anything you need. I can help you out with it, but please, you guys do the analysis. I should not be co-author on any of this work. So they actually did ask me for data. They asked me for data from my EPA research, which had been 10 years previous. And they asked me what irrigation rate we used. Well, thankfully, on green roofs, you can get them to survive very dry conditions. Thankfully, you can get it down to about a quarter of an inch of irrigation per week, spread out over 3 to 5, just depending on the season, irrigation events. And we originally had drip irrigation, but we had to actually take that off because the growing substrate on green roofs is so well drained, the water wouldn't move laterally by capillary action. It would just drain straight through. So we actually fitted the EPA green roof with MP rotors, state of the art at the time, and got the irrigation from 3/4 of an inch a week down to 1/4 of an inch a week, and ended up with better plant health. So we used that data, and that came out to about 5 inches of irrigation over the growing season. And so they took just our irrigation numbers and they assumed about 95% drought tolerant green roofs out of 1,000 acres and about 5% higher water use. So that would be turf grass, urban agriculture applications, those kinds of things. So those were their assumptions. And they only increased, based on their analysis, water use by 1.15%. And actually, they told me later that they had overassumed a few things and they dropped it down to less than 1% at peak season. And so that's incredible. And I said to my contact at Denver Water, I was like, so what kind of increase in water use in a industry would it take for Denver Water to really address that industry? He's like, oh, 8 or 9% increase in water use of domestic water use is when we would start. So he's like, you're not even touching the surface with green roofs. So even if people way over applied for some of their green roof systems, we wouldn't even touch the threshold of increasing even at 1,000 acres of green roof installations. I don't think we're going to see that though. So the International Trade Organization in North America is housed in Canada, Green Roofs for Healthy Cities. I'm on their board of directors, and I'm the research chair. So the research committee chair, I communicate with 50 or so academics across the world. Usually there's so few of us academics that work on green roofs that we all sort of know each other, especially from the literature. We all cite each other all the time, and we work on projects together all the time. So I do lots of conference planning. I just sent all 5 research track proceedings papers to Green Roofs for Healthy Cities today after copy editing. Lots of interesting, intense things that you have to do as the research chair for a fairly large organization like that. They also have a charitable arm called the Living Architecture. Nope, that's not right. They designate through their charitable arm regional academic centers of excellence in living architecture. And the Green Infrastructure Foundation, forgive me, it's called the Green Infrastructure Foundation, is the charitable arm of Green Roofs for Healthy Cities. And they designate regional academic centers of excellence living architecture. We have one here in Colorado. I'm co-chair on it with a colleague at the University of Colorado, Denver, Lila Tolderlund, who also works on green roofs. She's a landscape architect. I'm a horticulturalist, so we actually combine our skill sets very nicely. And there's several other academic centers all over North America. We're as far west as it gets, although we're trying to get one in Portland, and we have one coming in at Texas A&M. So those are the reps in the West. I'm also the editor of the Journal of Living Architecture. It's an open source, free research journal. We have usually two issues a year of 3 to 4 issues each, or 3 to 4 articles each. It really depends on demand, and all of us are, of course, volunteers when we have time to review and process and publish those journal articles. So thankfully, the entire archive is fully online, so anyone can access it anytime. And we have DOIs, so digital object identifiers, and you can download those anytime. A couple of key publications, and then we'll move into the Q&A because there's always a lot of Q&A. One of them is a book that just came out in March called Eco-Regional Green Roofs. I contributed specifically to 2 chapters, to the science chapter, so chapter 2, Theoretical Development of Eco-Regional Green Roofs. And then, of course, my ecoregion, the shortgrass prairie ecoregion. So definitely check that out. Bruce Dvorak, he's a faculty member at Texas A&M, good and wonderful colleague of mine. He collaborated with scientists all over the western half of the US, looking closely at green roofs, especially those that use native flora. We also have a fairly recent literature review from last year called Green Roof Research in North America, A Recent History and Future Strategies. It sort of gives a nice overview of green roofs and the research we've had in North America, although we drew a lot from Europe, since it was really the Europeans that popularized and modernized green roofs in the 60s and 70s. Of course, my book, Comments on Western Native Plants, actually one of my biggest buyers is the Canyonlands Natural History Association. And I send them boxes and boxes of common southwestern native plants. So if you're anywhere near any of the Canyonlands national parks, you can go pick one up at their bookstore. And the publication we wrote after my dissertation, we ended up getting a little lucky where our data sets ended up landing just right to show a difference between some protection from the solar panels versus exposed area. And we could draw some really fascinating conclusions, including we saw higher water in the substrate near the solar panels than the exposed areas far away. But now this is getting to be a little bit dated. But still, it's a key one of the few papers out there on the integration of solar panels and green roofs. So now I want to open it up to any questions you might have.
Awesome. That was fantastic. Thank you.
Thanks. My pleasure. It's fun for me, if you can't tell.
I can tell that you're very passionate about it, which makes it so much more fun to listen to. Just a reminder for everybody, please use the Q&A box for questions, and we'll go through those as they come in. And then when you do leave the event, if you could fill out the survey that pops up in your web browser, we would really appreciate it. So first question for you. So what can the general public do to take advantage of green roofs? Example, like existing homeowners, future homeowners, small business owners. Is it possible to retrofit, or do you have to start from the get-go with the green roof?
Thanks. I decided not to do sort of the whole Green Roofs 101 thing because I didn't want to spend time on that. But we can certainly go back and answer any of those questions. So I'll start with the last one. Yes, most existing buildings can be retrofitted with a green roof, but you need a structural engineer to evaluate what the weight loading capacity is. And often you need to re-roof, like put on a new membrane, because once you install that green roof, you don't want to pull it back up. And so, yes, that can absolutely occur. It happens all the time, especially in Europe, where they actually have much less strict building codes, at least back when a lot of their buildings were built. And so that's absolutely a possibility. So how to take advantage of green roofs? Well, one of the big things, and I go through this in my TED Talk, first is you can educate yourself. You can go to greenroofs.org. That's the Green Roofs for Healthy Cities website, and educate yourself on what they are. You can also go to greenroofs.com, which is a projects database on across the world on key green roofs. It doesn't have all of them. In fact, a fairly small number total of what we know actually exists. Another thing you can do is contact your local municipality and find out what they do in order to encourage the installation of green roofs. And most of them will tell you nothing, but it's where the conversation begins, let me tell you. We're working with a state senator here in Colorado right now, and I'm learning all kinds of tactics and ways to get interest in at various municipality levels. And small and medium business owners. So the way for small and medium business owners to really maximize their involvement with green roofs, I actually just took a picture not far from my house, like 5 miles from my house, where a restaurant was so into local foods that they installed a greenhouse on top of their building and then a green roof system around the perimeter of the greenhouse. And that's their, sort of selling point, their compelling part of fresh local food, some of it being grown right on site. I think mostly herbs and salad ingredients. But that's the way to do it, is to market it. Another way, and my buddy who does installs for green roofs here in Colorado area, he says he is putting up amenity decks all over the Front Range of Colorado, because a lot of these developers are realizing, oh, well, we were just ignoring this rooftop space. Why don't we turn it into an amenity space that either can be, where people come and gather, like a patio, or a business like a bar can open up, if it's a public or commercial building. And so I think there's definitely a movement, but a lot of times it really starts with that education, not just of the individual, but getting out there and telling the story.
I love that amenity deck. Just
Yeah.
that's the verbiage is great.
Yes.
Okay, so a few questions. So backing up a little bit, so you mentioned that the stressed plants produce more resources. And so I'm assuming that translates into the plants on the rooftops are stressed. Are there long-term implications like that? Does that affect the lifespan of those plants?
Yes, it does. So, it's sort of the when a tree is about to die, it blooms its most, right? And then that it's about to go out. So yes, we have noticed there's a correlation between relative abundance of bloom and lifespan. I don't have data for you yet, but there is a trend in that it does shorten the life of those plants. A green roof is always a stressful environment. It doesn't matter how much water, how many, ways you can slow the wind down. It's just a high solar radiation, high wind, very dry. Like, the vapor pressure deficit is as bad as it gets up on a rooftop, because all the factors that make it dry are, accentuated on a rooftop. So, and to put it all in perspective, we give them the worst soils or substrates that possible, just because we need those substrates to last a long time and not break down and shrink over time. And so we give them these essentially gravelly soils, so that there's no compaction, no breakdown over time, and we don't have to go in there and till it, because most of these systems are perennial.
Gotcha. Do you have to adjust the plants you choose based on hardiness zone, or can you stick with the hardiness zone for your area?
I just realized I should probably stop sharing. That's an excellent question. I lean much farther towards the colder zone just because it has to do with cold hardiness of the roots. There are some interesting things I've noticed. So Agave perryi, Perry's agave, is not terribly hardy here in Colorado. Probably the same in Utah. Maybe not all parts of Utah, but what we found is it does better on the green roof than on the ground. And we think it's because it's actually not sitting in clayey, damp soils over the winter. So apparently it must have decently hardy roots. And most of our green roofs do freeze solid, um, depending on what the conditions are, but they'll warm up during the day. That's actually even more stressful in the winter. We saw a lot of our plants, if they were in full sun, they would start metabolizing, kind of come out of dormancy, especially those that are not sensitive to day length. And then they would,
Hmm.
die back in the spring. You could see essentially the crowns dying back because some of those cells would start metabolizing, pull up water, fill up, freeze at night, explode, and you'd see damage. So um, I have a tendency to move towards the colder. The other interesting thing we found related to sort of exposure is we found that full sun plants can handle some shade on a green roof. It's such a stressful environment that actually having a little bit of break from the sun is a good thing. So I was working with some landscape architects on a project because I, of course, consult. There's no choice. Like there's so few of us that do this stuff. On a new green roof that's coming in Denver, and I mentioned to the landscape architects, I'm glad you guys did this sort of solar analysis, but you're going to end up seeing a transition where your full sun plants actually do better in part shade and your part shade plants do best in deep shade.
Hmm.
So it's like the extreme environments on a green roof sort of make it a zone colder and more sunny in a way, or we at least see better survivability.
Gotcha. So is that early warm up attributing, or does that attribute to the 2 to 6 weeks of earlier bloom time?
Yeah, so we are collecting data on the substrate temperatures, and that's what we think is the key factor is substrate temperature, and that since it's so usually tied, it's usually a day length and soil temperature combo, and it can vary within species is what we're finding as well,
Hmm.
or
Interesting.
between species, I should say, not within.
Gotcha. Okay, so next question. Do green roofs have the potential to be the next generation of urban parks?
They already are, actually. That's a great question. They already are. So, a couple of the parks I'll mention. Millennium Park in Chicago is a 2 million square foot green roof. It's over 5 levels.
2 million?
Yeah,
Wow.
it's over 5 levels of parking garage. So, that is one of the largest green spaces in their area. Another example is in Manhattan. And of course, we don't live in those cities, but I'll just give a couple of examples. So the High Line Park is I think they're between a mile and a half and 2 miles of old heavy duty railroad track converted into a park. It was a spontaneous vegetation area, and they retrofitted it into a green roof and made it a walkway. It's the longest distance on the island that you can walk without stopping at a stoplight
Huh.
because when I was there a couple of years ago, it was like 1.5 miles, but I think they've opened another section. It's like 2.2 miles or something now. So
Amazing.
yeah. And another example, there's a cap over one of the major highways in Dallas, where they had the downtown goes over an interstate in several sections at the street, and then it was open to the air above it. Well, they could structurally add a cap over those, close off those streets for pedestrians only, and green all those spaces. And so there's all kinds of options for urban spaces that are green roofs. I think that's the only way you're going to have major green spaces in cities is doing infill projects like that.
Hmm. What are some of the limiting factors? Like maybe top two?
Number one is price.
Gotcha.
That's always it. So they start at $8 a square foot on top of the membrane, and that's for a super shallow, very inexpensive seed-only green roof. The one in my picture behind me is probably around that price. That's like a 4-inch deep substrate, so super cheap on the price range. And when you get to intensive systems, which are greater than 6 inches of substrate, it starts at like $50 per square foot install cost. So that's 100% of the problem. There's not even really a secondary thing. There's so many benefits to green roofs that have been, evaluated and even looked at in life cycle cost analyses and economics and all of that. It's really just the price. Of course, it can also be infrastructure. But infrastructure comes down to cost too. So making sure the building or the area can withstand the green roof.
Gotcha. So can water be harvested from these roofs?
Depending on your water law, absolutely. In fact, there's some great articles in the Living Architecture Monitor, which is the quarterly newsletter. And it's a newsletter, it's not the journal that Greenwich for Healthy Cities puts out. And there's total building, like water harvesting and reuse plans that they've published in that. And so it happens all the time. Here in Colorado, we cannot. We have some antiquated laws that don't allow it. However, we got a letter from the state engineer that says as long as we don't capture water outside of the root zone, we can have any kind of green roof we want. So we're getting really creative inside the root zone right now.
Wow. So what is with the substrate you're using? What's the water quality like?
That comes out of it.
Yeah.
So it depends on what point. So at the initiation, it's always a little bit dirty. And it depends on what the components are. I'm the most interested in using biochar as an additive. It fulfills a lot of the criteria. It doesn't break down over time or very, very slowly. Has a really high CEC without losing a bunch of nutrients. It's stable, lightweight, a whole bunch of factors. So it really depends on what your components are. One of the better items, and I specify it in every intensive green roof I install, including, I advise that on the Denver Botanic Gardens Children's Garden, the first research location I mentioned, is we add zeolite, which is, clinitolite is its name mineralogically, and it has a really high cation exchange capacity as well. It's used in filters, water filters. So as long as there's not a new disturbance or it's been recently installed, we get out as clean a water as we do off of any rooftop.
Huh. Can you spell that?
Zeolite is the easiest one. I'm not sure I could spell clinitolite. Zeolite is Zeolite.
Oh, just like it sounds. Okay.
Yes.
Man, this is really interesting.
Good.
Well, let's see, maybe there's one more question. Has there been any research on pollinator habitat connectivity across cities with the Green Roof Initiative and or wildlife immigration migration?
Excellent question, Chelsea. So not directly green roofs, but we're trying, especially in my lab, we're actually trying to connect those two literature groups because green corridors are, you know, one of the sort of more popular phrases for what you're talking about. They've always been traditionally on the ground. And restoration ecology, which is basically trying to not exactly repeat, but try to replicate or at least emulate ecology in urban areas. We're trying to bridge those two things into the green roof work. So there's sort of bits and pieces, but they're islands right now of literature. So not really a lot connected. And man, I see all of it come through as editor. I see all those things. So I would love to see some work on that too, Chelsea.
Yeah, that would be neat. Let's see.
I
Oh,
see
this
the
is a good
question. Do you want me
question.
just to answer?
Yeah, if you,
Awesome.
the ongoing
Oh,
maintenance one.
Gary, you worked with Jack. Oh, he loves choyas. I planted a choya for him. I was his assistant for a little while, and he planted some choyas at his retirement village. Oh, that's so fantastic. I love it. So I'm going to answer the question from Scott. How does the ongoing maintenance cost of a green roof compare to that of a normal roof? It's more. There's no doubt about it, but actually it may not be a lot more. The super shallow systems that don't have a ton of diversity only require about 50 cents to $1.50 per square foot of maintenance per year. So that means about a day of work, you know, or half a day of work, depending on its size, for a green roof per month of the growing season. And then 2 checks over the winter, 2 or 3 checks over the winter. We usually actually need to winter water in order to get plants to not desiccate over the winter. The ROI is an interesting thing. It depends on the building type and the application. There's a great paper by Rohan Luluwalaja. Sorry, that is how you actually say his name. It's really hard to spell too, but he's at Greeners for Healthy Cities. So all you have to do is on the greeners.org website, search ROI, and you'll come up with his paper. And so ROI depends. He estimates on average 7 to 15 years is the benchmark I recall, but you'll need to double check me on that.
Okay.
And so that's about how long it takes to break in it, even depending on a whole bunch of factors. There are, of course, a bunch of green roofs that will never totally pay off. But here's the thing. Keep in mind that a green roof prevents the 2 things that break down rooftop membranes over time from touching the membrane. That's UV light, ultraviolet light, and the freeze-thaw cycle. So the daily shrink and swell over the winter especially. Those are the 2 things that will break down a membrane over time. I'm not talking about direct impact stuff like if you have a rake or a shovel and you penetrate. That's a different story. But those are the things that break down membranes and need them to be replaced. So most membranes only last 20 years. If you put a green roof on top of it, if you put a green roof on any plastic, it will last for decades. And so there are green roofs here in the US and in Europe that are 100+ years old and have not had to be replaced. So at the very minimum, if you get to 20 years, you're saving yourself the cost of re-roof, which is usually about the price of a green roof.
That's impressive.
Mm-hmm.
Cool. All right, well we are wrapping up. We're getting close to time. That was amazing. Thank you guys for all the great questions. Again, there's a survey that's going to pop up in your browser. Please fill that out, and we will get this posted on YouTube shortly so you can rewatch and share with your colleagues. Thank you so much, Jennifer. Thank you for everyone.
Oh, my pleasure, Candace.
It was
Bye.
great to meet you. Bye, everybody. Have a great day.